Hi, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
I'd love to see you again, Megan. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think, when did we talk? Like 2018, 2019?
Yeah, maybe 3 years ago.
It doesn't seem that long ago.
No, I know. And I've been following, of course, all the craziness that you deal with. So,
Yeah, it's sort of endless, eh?
yeah, yeah. You say as a Canadian, did we get to do this podcast in Canadian? Because I can speak Canadian because I'm Canadian. So
Oh,
I can,
that's right, of course.
right, I
So
can
where's your
speak
A?
Canadian. So how do you want to go about this interview?
Okay, well, you're speaking Ontario. I'm
Oh,
from
is that
Vancouver.
Ontario? What
That's
is
that's your East Coast accent.
what is West Coast accent?
I don't know. Do I sound like I have an accent? I've been
No,
living
not
in
to
Mexico
me.
and people told me that I have a Canadian accent, but I don't feel that I have an accent, so I have no idea what that
Well, no
sounds
one
like.
ever feels they have an accent, but no, you have a less pronounced, because you're right. The Eastern Canadian is also shared by Michigan. It's like if you
Oh,
watch
okay.
Fargo, they have, and they call soda pop, like they have the same linguistic. So yeah. So the
I say pop.
West Coast may be more close to American.
I mean, yeah, I think my most Canadian things are my constant A's, and that makes me a very good
Right.
stereotype of a Canadian, eh?
And you probably are cheap and don't tip
No,
properly.
I do. I'm a good tipper. That's just because we're bougie in Vancouver, though, I think.
Right.
Anyway, I'm glad to have you. Thanks a lot. I'm
Well, I'm
looking
pleased
forward
to
to
be
this
here.
conversation. Um, I want to start by asking you, do you identify as a feminist?
Yeah, I always have.
Yeah. Okay. And what does that mean to you?
Well, it's changed over time, but when I began my journalistic career at the Toronto Sun, um, I I came of age in the 80s and I was following the 70s feminists who were very empowering and, sort of a riff on the song, whatever a man can do, I can do better. And, that we were career minded, that we shouldn't face any obstacles because of our sex. And I did a lot of early reporting on the feminist movement of Canada, actually. And what discouraged me was as this young, rah-rah feminist was that, which I would later discover, unlike American feminism, um, Canadian feminism was all federally subsidized. So the major women's groups, I'm now trying to remember what was our equivalent to the national organizations for women, but whatever they were all heavily government subsidized. So they didn't have to rely on grassroots donations. And as a result, there was a very monolithic voice. Not that there wasn't in America, but there was a very monolithic voice. And it was very weighted against men. It was weighted against mothers. It was very rigid in what it prescribed women to do, which is career and forget men. And as a young woman, I didn't like that message. And so I started to report on that, and said, why did it have to be this way? Why did it have to be either or? And one of the first articles I wrote was for Saturday Magazine, which had a cover. It's like so gone, such another media world, but had a cover of like women against women. And it was like the feminists against mothers. And it was so incendiary, but it was based on this idea that why does being a feminist mean you have to be anti-men, you have to be anti-motherhood. It seemed very one-dimensional to me at that time as a young woman.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the kind of feminism that I participated in, you know, I don't know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I've been a feminist since I was a child, essentially, but I sort of discovered, I suppose, like radical feminism, like Andrea Dworkin and
Mm-hmm.
Sheila Jeffries and all those kinds of people. maybe when I was around 20 or something like that. And I found that really empowering, I think, because at that age I had a lot of anger and I didn't know where to put it, and I didn't, you're really not empowered when you're that age. Like, you have no power in the world. You don't have any money. You don't have a
Right,
career.
right.
You don't
And
know what you're
nobody's going to
doing.
give you a serious job. I mean, unless you're like some credible athlete or ballerina or something, no one's going to entrust you with anything more than the photocopier until you're about 28.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And, fair enough.
Right. No, no, fair.
But I mean, and I don't think that it was just I don't think that it was just radical feminism. Radical feminism has this reputation of like hating men and hating sex and being anti-mother. I think that's sort of more of a modern feminism in general issue. And I guess, I mean, like, why do you think that happened? Why do you think that feminism turned into sort of I suppose it's like an attack on women's traditional roles, which I'm not
Mhm.
actually necessarily opposed
Opposed
to.
to, right.
But when did you see that happen? Like,
Well, okay, so there's a number of threads. Um, the thread that came in the 1950s was a post-war phenomenon. That you have to remember that womanhood in the 50s was an entirely post-war creation. That before then, women worked. They worked at all levels. And by the way, working was not fun. Like most jobs, we have to posit that careers are different from jobs. And when most women work, it was like shitty jobs. Maybe they enjoyed it, but the point was the minute you could get out of working and be bourgeois and have children and have someone take care of your children and clean your house, and you did volunteer work or you did other things, that was a very traditional woman's life. Post 1950s, post war, this whole idea that an educated woman would be confined to her home, told that the miracle of the washing machine would save her from having to hire help. Post-war, imagine what you've been through, the death and the destruction. So coming home, having men home, having affluence, having these beautiful little suburban houses, which we would then come to hate, but at the time seemed like a freaking miracle. There was a lot, like that post-war time, you can never look at it outside of the fact of the war. And to just project backwards and say, oh, women were just confined to the home and it was sexism is not a fair assessment. But it did breed resentment. And Betty Friedan was the first one to break out. And she was very unhappily married, but she always liked men and she liked sex. But she was very unhappily married. She was obviously a profoundly intelligent woman. She totally resented the Betty Draper lifestyle, as many came to do. And so she wrote this seismic book. So fast forward. So you have the women's movement of the 1970s, which of many movements of its time was informed by Marxism and the leftist thought of the time. So if you go back and you read those, not Betty Friedan, but other radical texts of that time, what we would call radical feminism, if you swap out, the word capitalist oppressor from, it was like a language swap. It was women were unfailingly oppressed by men. It was a dynamic that could never be resolved until the woman broke free. And so a lot of its ideology was informed by that era, Marxism light. And I think when I came of age in the 80s, I took for granted so much of the progress that had been made, so much what these women had done to fight against that post-war sexism, which was really, really there. It's not to deny it wasn't there. And but also not to think of oneself as a victim. And this is where I could say I was totally bratty and an asshole to all these women who had fought for so much. And then you come along and go, thanks, world is great. I don't know what you're complaining about. Like, I totally get that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that's progress, where that's the point. The next generation comes along and goes, thank you. This is wonderful. I'm now going to live my life as a free person. I'm going to make these choices. I feel very empowered. I worked as a reporter on a newspaper. My mother, who had also been a journalist, had done a lot of stuff, but had been more confined to the lifestyle pages. You know, we weren't anymore. We were, even by our very crusty old bosses, told to go pursue all the stories we wanted. So it didn't feel constraining. And then when I'd go cover rallies and things, you'd see these older women complaining and railing against the war of the past. And that bothered me. And I felt very sexually empowered. Thank you, sexual revolution. So I didn't understand what they were talking about, where men unfailingly had control over us. And none of it made sense to me. So that's what I started to write about. And I got a lot of pushback from, because of a prevailing ideology that's still remained in the feminist movement and there hasn't been a lot of change. It's had permutations, but it's never lost this idea that we have to be politically opposed to men. That at some level, motherhood and marriage is enslaving. At some level, will never earn more than men, and that's entirely because of sexism. Like, whatever our problems are, it's chalked up to sexism and misogyny, and not to more real world issues that women face. So that's always been my cause and my passion, and that's how I've pursued feminism.
Right, and it's presented in a very simplistic way. You know, the complexities of why women might make less money than men are not really addressed, for example. And you know what frustrates me is that I feel that Canadian feminists will refuse to acknowledge that actually women in Canada, you know, have it pretty good, especially in comparison to a lot of other countries, you know, third world countries, where women really still do face really horrific violence and oppression. And of course, women in Canada, you know, domestic violence is still a really big problem.
Mm-hmm.
Rape is still a really big problem. Prostitution and sex trafficking and pornography, those are big problems. But in as far as like our choices, you know, our ability to kind of operate autonomously and do what we want in our lives, you know, get an education, have a career, decide whether or not we want to have kids or get married, you know, we can own cars and property and have credit cards and all those things that the second wave and first wave feminists like fought for. And yet it's like, no, things are still horrible. We're still just as oppressed as all women everywhere. And in fact, this is a whole other topic, but a lot of Canadian feminists refuse to sort of criticize like Muslim cultures in Saudi Arabia.
Right. Well, that's just
like,
weird. That's just weird. That's weird. Like, it's like two political correctness, like out canceling each other, you know, that the idea that you would not see these societies as highly misogynistic and something to fight for. One of the guests I recently had on our podcast is a woman named Gail Semick Lemon. And she's a really impressive journalist who went and documented the Kurdish women who fought ISIS, that they came from traditional, very traditional families, not traditional like Saudi Arabia traditional, and not super Islamic, but still very traditional families in the Kurdish areas of Syria, where they were expected to marry who they were told to marry. It was thought education was wasted on them. They were often told not to play sports, and they felt very oppressed. But many of them just went along with it because what was the choice, right? Like, you didn't have other examples. And then ISIS starts taking over a lot of Syria. And suddenly you have this enemy force coming at you that its idea is literally to enslave you and put you in cages and sell you. Like that was what was happening. And these women just thought, no, that's not happening to me. And they left their families to go and take up arms. They formed like a female constitution that they said that they would serve not under men, but they would serve under each other. And it worked. And not only did they start fighting in the most horrific circumstances you can imagine in modern warfare, in these small cities where you're fighting house to house. If you're captured, it's the worst thing you can imagine. And not only that, but they also then took on male troops who would, come under their command. And they came under their command, and it was an incredibly successful operation. And they beat back ISIS, and they got American special ops on their side. So when, we have problems, but when you start looking at our problems comparatively and overemphasizing our problems in comparison, like we should feel lucky for what we have. And we should be working to better our situations. And we should be looking for, more equity, and how do we work out these eternal problems of having children and realizing our ambitions. But seriously, and that's this weird thing with with this Western feminism is you do not see the problems that could be, and maybe fine, all our problems are our problems. Like my husband jokes, okay, I don't have third world problems. I don't have cholera, but I still have problems, and they're my problems, and they're first world problems. Okay, we have first world problems, but don't try to put them on the scale of third world problems.
Right. And I mean, like problems are problems. It's not, you can always compare and be like, oh, well, at least you're alive. Like at
I
least
don't have cholera.
Like, you have a roof over your head.
I have drinking water.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. But I mean, obviously problems still matter. And, and obviously sexism still does exist in our culture.
Right.
But I suppose like, one of the things that I've begun to notice sort of more recently is that there's this weird thing where modern feminism tells women, especially young women, that they're sort of permanently victims. Like they're always being victimized, and they're talking about, what those types might refer to as like microaggressions. Like it's like, things that are, not really such a big deal, but are treated as though they really are a big deal. Like, a man flirts with you at work or at the bar, or things like man spreading, or we can talk about all these conversations about toxic masculinity. Like, it's like, I think a lot of young women are sort of trained to act and behave and assume that they're under attack all the time. Like a man interrupted me and I'm super oppressed. And, men can be condescending and can interrupt a lot and can be really bad listeners. But I mean, I interrupt people all the time.
Yeah,
also,
but
so I can't really just put that on men.
Well, I think
it's not that big of a deal. Like you can just like, if a man is interrupting me, then I'll just be like, stop interrupting me. Like you're not listening. Like
right, but it's a bigger problem of how we are contriving reasons not to be able to talk to each other. And it's worrisome. I mean, it's part of the whole culture that we have. And I want to stress on right and left, each side has its own problems. And on the left, we call it now cancel culture, but where it's this safety culture where, anything that it's a very anti-free speech of any kind, like anything you say that I can be offended by is actually an act of violence. And what it really does is it denigrates actual violence. Like, a word that offends you is not the same thing as a bullet to your head. And a man who clumsily flirts with you is not the same thing as rape. But we have started to conflate these things, with the result that the actual issues that we have cannot be addressed, because we have created this whole perception of oppression that is not based on actual reality, and acts of oppression which are not based on oppression.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, so I've most of my like career writing about feminism has been focused on criticizing third wave feminism and this sort of idea that, you know, a woman can be empowered by anything she says she's empowered by. And, you know, that young women are going to be empowered by like posting sexy selfies on the internet
Mhm.
and, you know, sort of in some ways behaving sexually like men. And that was something that always has frustrated me about this iteration of feminism or whatever. Like this idea that we tell young women that they can and should be like men, and that again that they should have sex like men. And I really value, like, sexual freedom for women is a really important thing. I really value that. I think it's a big deal that women can now, you know, like
Mhm.
have sex outside of marriage and have pleasure in sex and sort
Right,
of
and
do
have
what
the
they
pill and not
want.
have to worry about getting pregnant.
And yeah, and make choices about if they want to like have a baby with this
Mhm.
guy, right? That they maybe just wanted to have sex with or just wanted to date for a while. But I don't actually think, like, I think that was a big mistake on the part of, you know, third wave feminists, because I don't actually think that women, I mean, women can't have sex like men, but I don't think that women want to have sex like men. And I remember being a young woman and sort of thinking that I should, you know, that I should be having sex. I can have casual sex, I can have a one night stand, and like I shouldn't feel anything about it. And this
Mhm.
makes me like a powerful woman. Like I'm kind of like a player, like one of the boys. And at a certain point, I sort of realized, you know, like this isn't satisfying for me
Mhm.
physically or mentally or emotionally. Um,
Well,
so
it gets into the point of biological denial. That part of the sexual revolution, the Erica Jong era of have sex like men, she called it, can I swear on your podcast? She called it the zipless fuck. Like, you just go and you have these amazing sexual experiences with no attachment, like men. And it was, I think, very, very exciting for a bit. And uh, and it was fun if you were doing it on your own. But when society en masse began to do it, and women suddenly realized, wait, um, we've just given men a license to, you know, have sex, no consequences, no commitment, and the men are going like,
great.
really?
This is perfect.
Nothing? There's no
Great deal.
commitment? You're not expecting anything of me? I mean, we used to be, we'd have to get married and things like that. So, like, there are benefits for relieving some of the constraints, but it also puts in denial that women have different attitudes towards sex, that they approach sex differently. And it's not to say you're not going to enjoy the occasional one night stand or whatever. But it's also to say that if you are looking for a meaningful relationship, and I talk about this with my young daughters who are, you know, in their 20s and very woke in every way, but they understand intuitively that what they want out of these encounters is not what a man wants. And they get ground down by, you know, my youngest daughter in high school, by these guys who, I don't know, watching porn or whatever they watch, and kind of expecting certain behaviors from young women. Um and if you don't want to be part of that, it's just degrading. You're just potentially treated like a prostitute. And that's not what you want. But
No.
yet we've lost the language to say, that's not what I want.
Yeah.
And if you say that's not what I want, they're like, what are you, prudish? Are you not, and it's a bad situation that we have put young women into. And I think there's a good reason why this younger Gen Zers have depression and anxiety and are telling people they're not having sex. I don't know whether that means intercourse or whether it means like other types of sex, but the point is that it's not, they're not embracing it like Erica Jong. They're not going in there and going, whoa, sex. It's become this oppressive, unsatisfactory thing that makes them unhappy when it should be joyful. It should be part of a fulfilling relationship. Men and women should be having these wonderful connections with each other. So if we're not, we have to ask ourselves, why not? What is going wrong? What is it? And if we're not allowed to speak honestly about biological differences and men and women taking different approaches to sex, we will never be able to answer that question.
Right. And, I think it's so sad because I feel like young women today have grown up in this, porn culture where pornography is normalized to the point where girls and young women feel like they have to participate. Like it's totally normal to, meet a guy online and send him nudes. Like, and I would have never, I still don't do that now, but I would have never done that when I was 20. We didn't have dating apps. Like we weren't online in that way, but it's like,
Right.
Like and that they have to sort of, pornify themselves and sexualize themselves online. And that this is like, how you're going to get a boyfriend. Like that's not how you're going to get a boyfriend actually. Like, and if a guy likes you and wants to hook up with you or wants to date you, he's not going to need you to send him a nude. You guys can just meet up and then you can have sex and then he'll see you naked. So there's a lot that I don't really understand about all this, but
right.
It's sort of, I mean, I know that it's been normalized, but at the same time, I can't help just be frustrated and be like, why are you participating in this? Like, why are you doing it? Like, you don't have to do it.
You've lost a language of courtship. And the language of courtship depended on letting a man make the first moves. You can call it power. You can, however you want to like politicize it. But in the end, that, men making the first moves, letting men do the pursuing, goes back to ancient times. And so when you eliminate that and you try to tell women that this should not be the case, they should be making all these moves, they should be willing to do whatever, it makes no sense. And it doesn't lead to the kind of relationships that I think women want and men ultimately want too. I mean, we've got this, I feel like we've got two sides that do not suddenly know how to communicate at all. And both sides are terrified. The men are terrified and they're terrified. They don't know what to do. They think, well, we're told women want to behave like porn stars. And like, that's what I see. Why don't you want to do this? And women are like, and it's a sad situation. And there's nowhere that they can turn to get the right answers. It's frustrating.
Yeah, well, and I feel like radical feminism sort of got a bit close. Like I remember one of the first books, I mean, she's not a radical feminist, but one of the first books that sort of turned me on to the idea that I was like, oh, it's okay that I don't like watching pornography and going to strip clubs. Like I don't have to do that to be like a cool, open-minded, like sexually liberated woman. Because it always made me uncomfortable and grossed out and I hated it. But I felt like that's what I was supposed to be into because that's what third wave feminism said. Yeah, and you're prudish if you don't like that stuff. But I read Ariel Levy's book, Female Chauvinist Pigs. Did you ever read that?
No, I didn't.
I mean, it's a good book. Like I recommended it to a lot of young women. Like when young women would be like, "Oh, what should I do?" Like good introduction to feminism, sort of radical. But it criticized that hypersexualized, like hyper pornified, like girls gone wild culture where girls were supposed to like have their tits out all the time and like having sex on camera and, making out with other women because that's what men like to see because they've
Yeah.
learned from pornography that,
Right.
like
No, it's a kind of new
heterosexual women also
enslavement.
like to perform fake
Right.
lesbian sex for them.
Right.
But, I think it got close, but then I think it also sort of misses the mark in that it goes I don't want to go it goes too far is such a cliche, right? But it goes to the point where it's like heterosexuality is bad and heterosexual sex is bad and heterosexual couplings are just inherently problematic and not equal and marriage is bad. And I've long been a critic of marriage, to be honest, and now I'm sort of like, like, I mean, it's not my goal to get married, but sure, I would. It's not, I'm
Mhm.
not like against it in the way that I used to be, but all of those things. And you really kind of internalize that. And I think it really creates like an unnecessary conflict between men and women and between men and women in your personal life. If you're a young woman and you're feeling like you're being oppressed in your relationship all the time, I mean, maybe you are being oppressed in your relationship, but maybe you just are sort of wanting or trying to force something that's really never going to happen.
Right. I think there was a kind of sweet spot. I don't know when it was, maybe the early 70s, where there was this kind of acknowledgement of male sexism, Don Draper post-war, and then there was this kind of blossoming of female sexuality, and there was this sort of leaving of marriages that had been done for the sake of getting married, and then there was this like moment, and I may be romanticizing it, but there's this moment where there was this brief moment where men and women came together and they discovered their like sexuality, and women demanded that their sexual needs be taken seriously, and men were like, sure. And it was a kind of nice thing that lasted 5 minutes. And I think today it can and could be that way, but I always thought one of the worst phrases of that era of feminism was the personal is political. The personal should never be political. Never,
Right,
ever, ever.
right,
That
right.
that creates totalitarian systems. The personal is personal. And when you enter into a relationship with a man or with anyone, the main thing is it's based on mutual respect. And if there's mutual respect, you don't have to get into union agreements about who does what, Well, I loaded the dishwasher, so I guess you're, unloading like if you love each other and you are in a relationship of mutual respect, you want to please each other. It's not oppressive. I want to please my husband. My husband wants to please me. We want to be happy together. We respect each other. We both want the best for the other. We both support the other in their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. If we have children, we work out the best arrangement. But you're not constantly bartering. And I think that's one of the sad things of relationships, that if a woman feels like the minute she does loads the dishwasher, that's it, I'm being oppressed, or a man feels nagged or whatever, it's a terrible dynamic. But if you both respect each other and you will both want the best for each other and you're both kind to each other, that doesn't happen, and then you have a threshold on which to negotiate all the other things. It's not to say that you don't get into arguments about who does what, but it's based on a premise of goodwill, of mutual goodwill. And we've taken that language away a lot, and that young women are very mistrustful. They think they're going to be oppressed, and men are very mistrustful. They think they're going to be shamed, and they feel that they're going to be in a relationship where they're denigrated and told they're oppressors and told that everything they say and do is wrong, and it's not good for anybody. And the sexes have to get along. I mean, future of humanity depends on it. Like, we can't just stop doing this, so
Yeah.
if we're all just self-empowered individuals, like atoms, we're not we won't continue to exist, so we have to work it out.
Yeah. I've been thinking about that recently and talking about that recently, that idea that you should be forcing your politics onto your relationship so that, and again, like I feel like I repeat myself so much, but it's like I'm just trying to be like accountable for the fact that like I did this stuff and I sort of have been thinking about it in the past few years and been like, oh, maybe that was not the right way to go about this. Like forcing your like feminism or your Marxism or whatever onto your intimate relationship with your partner. I mean, God, how exhausting. But also like I think you're right, is like I think that the key issue is respect, which I'm sure some might argue is political, that's like a feminist aim, men respecting women,
Mhm.
but it doesn't really, it's not, I don't think it actually is political, because I think it's like if you trust your partner and you know that your partner respects you, then you don't feel like you have to argue about everything. You don't have to be combative. You don't have to like win every argument or prove every point. And I think that young women do sort of enter into relationships with men, and just, not even with their boyfriends, just like men that they're dating or men that they're hanging out with friends, in this way where they just have to fight everything and they have to argue about everything and
It's
everything is
so
about
exhausting.
sexism. And it's like, God, why would I mean, first of all, why would anybody want to hang out with you if you behave like that? Like,
Right.
but you
Right.
don't, everything shouldn't be a fight all the time. Like you kind of just want to like relax and hang out and be yourself and not have to argue about freaking politics all the time.
Right. And there's a whole history of romantic literature that, um, when you look at the best romantic literature, the men respect the women, and not in a patronizing way. That the best marriages through history were partnerships, and um, each worked to their strengths. And women have strengths, men have strengths. Um, you know, Men are really good at lifting heavy stuff. Um, and, and like denying that, like, is just
I know
silly.
they're pretty handy. Like they
Well, no,
know how to
actually,
fix stuff that I don't know how to
no. In
fix.
our
They can fight
household,
off
it's the
predators.
reverse.
I
I
can't.
wield the power drill, but my husband is tech support.
Oh, I do
But
not know how to
but
use a
it's also
drill.
just finding what are your strengths, what are your true being living. We talk about living in truth, like living in truth. And one of the things, I mean, when I first had our first child, it was the early 90s, and I was very schooled in the we are exactly the same, we are all very equal. I have a baby, and then, oh my God, suddenly I'm nursing. My husband's not nursing. He's not nursing. His chest isn't exploding every 4 hours. Um, and I can approach this as being a completely unfair situation. And biology is trying to make it destiny, and I can rail against that. But in the end, I'm the one nursing, and he's not. And so, how are we going to make this work? And am I a lesser person because I nurse?
Mm.
Am I a lesser person because I want to step back and say, you know what, all those things I thought I would be doing this year, probably not going to happen. And he's like, okay, so I'm going to step up and do this. Like, that's what you do. That's how you support each other. That's how you have a family. You don't have a family by the woman sitting there nursing and being aggrieved that she's nursing, and the man like, what the hell, you said you were going to the office 2 weeks from now, what's happening with that? Like, that's not going to end in success.
Right.
It has to be a series of compromises and acknowledgments of reality and what you really want to do, not what you profess or think you ought to be doing.
Yeah, and I know, I mean, you've talked about, I was just listening to an interview that you did. You've talked about, women, maybe just people in general. I think you were talking about women specifically not accepting adulthood, and sort of this modern trend of women waiting to have babies and get married. And I think you, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you sort of perceive it as a problem, like women are waiting too long. And I do think there is a thing. Like I have friends who got to, 39 years old and were like, "Oh shit, I want to have a baby. Now I'm desperate. Like I gotta freeze my eggs and yada yada
Mm-hmm.
yada." And it's like at that point, it's sort of almost too late. Like I know women
Right.
who've had babies at 43 or
Right. You can
41 or whatever.
still,
Like it happens, but
take.
it's harder, and some women at that point can't.
Right. And this was the premise of my first book, which came out in 1999, maybe 2000, which was
Mm.
called What Our Mothers Didn't Tell Us. And it was sort of pushing back on a lot of these ideological feminist ideas that we didn't want motherhood, the careers would be the be all and end all, marriage was enslaving, so screw that, and the result was that it had young women postponing and postponing and postponing these decisions about marriage and motherhood while putting everything into their career. And what you said earlier in the program, like in your 20s, no one's trusting you with anything but the photocopier. It's so nature designed your 20s. I'll say why this is not as relevant today, but nature basically decided young women, you need to have babies now, and that's not always convenient, but that's when your body is most ready for it. That's when also by nature you're most flexible and mentally up for it, even if you don't think you are. So, okay, but we're modern women, we live longer. And also, can we just say men today are very postponed adolescents, that men, I think it's safe to say, until their 30s are not thinking even of settling down, or
No,
having
I mean,
families.
I know men who are in their 40s who are still thinking, like,
Right,
oh, maybe I'll get married and have babies someday. And I'm
right.
like, are you all insane?
But they have the biological advantage. Now
Sure,
we're
but still,
finding,
they're not behaving in a way where they're pursuing a
no, because
relationship and
in their
babies.
mind,
Like,
why should they?
right.
And we're now finding out that the older you have as a man, like there are biological repercussions, that there are higher incidence of autism, for example, in your children.
Hmm.
But be that as it may, the male has no reason, if he doesn't have to that's what social conformity in previous eras were like. The man had no biological imperative to settle down early, so all of society conspired to make him settle down early, and women, didn't sleep with men anything because they had to get married. Okay, there are many offsetting benefits for not living in that kind of world, but as you point out, so I think this is a false message that young women get, that you have endless time, that you probably don't want to. If you want kids at all, you're not going to really want to think about them till you've got your career up and running. So now you're getting into 30, 31, 35, and from a biological perspective, yes, it's true that our modern science has made it much easier for you to get pregnant, but it's still, there are many obstacles. And the later you push it, the more skeptical, the more dodgy it becomes. And then, and this is the dark thing that no one will tell you, and I'll say, and I'll be prepared to be canceled for it. Your sexual appeal wanes as a woman. Let's just accept it. And men, it's you can call it discriminatory. But as you get older, I remember writing in my book that when you're in your 20s, like there are just so many men. They're like the subway cars at rush hour. They're all coming through at regular intervals. And then you get older and older, and in your 30s, and suddenly it's like the New York subway system at midnight. And there are fewer and fewer cars. And when the cars stop and the doors open, it's filled with crazy people. And this is the thing that no one will tell you honestly, that it's a little less true. Like I think young women are, into their 30s are more successful than in my time, but it's a thing. And so we may be looking now at women settling down at 30 with men who are 38 or 40 and women who are 32. But women still do have a biological clock. There is an optimal moment for your body to have them. And my point also was, if you're an ambitious woman, it made a lot more sense to have kids early because of the photocopying rule. That if you have your kids if you can arrange it, if it works out to have your kids in your 20s, you don't really get going till your 30s and 40s in your careers. So you have a lot of time to mess about. And what you would be doing as interns, you could be doing as a young mother if, again, fate works out that way. But my advice was always to women, stop putting this decision off. Stop thinking of marriage and motherhood as an auxiliary. Because in the end, our marriages, male or female, our families are the most important relationships we have. Jobs will come and go. Jobs are important. Careers, if you're lucky to have one, are important. But what is the satisfaction you get out of life? What are your primary relationships? What is the joy of life? That's all going to come from your most intimate relationships. And they should not, and it bothered me that you'd have all these guidance counselors for your careers, but nobody was saying, how do I arrange my life so I can achieve my ambitions, but also achieve the family relationships that I want? And maybe that's a course that needs to be taught to men as well, that, you suddenly see the male equivalent is some 45-year-old who's just like wakes up one day and realizes like he's got a stiff leg and macaroni and cheese in the freezer and no one really cares about him. And, that's not a good existence either. That men want these, men will wake up maybe a little later than women, but they wake up and they say, you know what? I'm tired of being a bachelor, tired of living like a college frat boy. I want a more meaningful relationship. I want to step up. I want to have family. How am I going to do it?
Yeah. Or I want an intimate relationship. I mean, I never wanted to have kids when I was 20. I still don't want to have kids like this. I probably am somewhat of an anomaly. So it was hard for me when I was younger to relate to women who wanted kids, because I was like, why would you want a baby in your house or coming out of your body, you crazy person?
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought. Trust me.
So like, I'm happy, and I just never did. But I mean, I acknowledge that this is like a biological thing.
There is no argument for children. There is no argument for children. No, there's no, like, when you are you, and you think, I mean, my husband, we got married crazily young. We were anomalies. It just happened that we did. And it was his forceful nature that we got married, because I was like very modern. Like, we could live together. It's fine. But he was also the force to have children. And I think I had my first child at 28, and I had zero thought about it. Like, I was really happy just coasting. I didn't think about having children. I didn't have the baby urges to have children. And I remember David saying to me, I don't want to be an old dad. And that had a real resonance. And that sort of hit me. And then I thought about, well, maybe I was just being too carefree and selfish. And so we had this child, and within 8 months, his mother had died. She had ongoing leukemia, but it had been you never thought that it was actually going to hit, but it did. So for 8 months, she was able to enjoy this child. And then it really hits you, and like, if I'm going to have kids, I want them to know my parents. I want them to know them as young people. I don't want them to know them as infirm people. If I'm going to be a parent, I want to be a young parent. I don't want to be like my own parents were. I want to be able to have energy and fun. Like, my nightmare is having my first child like late in life, like, oh my God, now our third child is just about to leave the house, and it's sad but lovely. Like, I feel still very youthful. And there's a kind of natural pattern that when you defy it, it has everything has its repercussions. So we have been more constrained as young people because we had kids early. On the other hand, we're going to be more liberated as middle-aged and older people because we did. But you just, I guess the thing that bothers me is nobody is instructed or cautioned to think about these things in this way, or give the importance to these decisions that you might not want kids now. And there'll be no arguments for kids because you can make a list of positive and negatives. And when you make the list, the negatives outweigh every positive until you actually have the kid. And then all the positives that you can't write them down. You don't know what they are until you've had the kid. And then the negatives just seem like irritants. Oh, it cries. Who cares? But no one is thinking seriously of I might not want a kid when I'm 20, 30, 35. What happens when I'm 60 and I don't have a kid and it's too late? How am I going to feel? How am I going to feel not having that family around me? Having grown kids is an amazing thing. My kids are now my friends. And that's a thing that you cannot project. You cannot put on your list of pros and cons. But having a grown family, watching them have children, that's an amazing thing that we've sort of lost the fabric of. We've lost that this is just a natural part of life. It's all become very choice oriented and individualized.
I mean, I think what you're saying about having kids early in your 20s actually does kind of make a lot of sense. I would question my ability in any case to choose a good partner at that age, because I feel that
right.
my
No, to be fair, it's
relationships
a
have
lottery.
improved
It's
as I'm
total
older.
lottery. It's luck.
Like, imagine if I was with my boyfriend that I had at 20. Like, we're completely different people. Like, it never would have worked. But I think, and I think it's really, again, I think it's really important that women now do have the choice. Like, they can sort of create the lives that they want. And I've made choices because I have prioritized my work and my career.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important to me. And I have prioritized my freedom and my ability to travel and sort of do what I want or whatever. And I'm happy with those decisions. But I see what you're saying. And a lot of women do get to a certain age and they realize, like, oh shit, like, I really should have done this earlier, instead of, thinking or being told that I can have it all and I can wait. And because, I always feel really sad for women who are like, again, who get to like 39, 40, whatever, and are like, oh, I want to have kids, I should think about freezing my eggs. And I was like, that's not a solution. Like, freezing your eggs, first of all, is really, really expensive. And it's not a guarantee of anything. Like, it really doesn't even work that well. And I think a big thing that's happened, not just for women, but for our culture in general and for people in general in the West, is that we think that we've outsmarted nature. Mm-hmm. Like, we don't, biology, nah. Like, that, like, evolution, nah. Like, we're not animals. And it's like, no, you are. Like,
right. And that's what you discover when you have a baby. Let me know. And yeah, your chest explodes and you're going like, why is my chest exploding? But it's also, I think, to your point, and of course, I didn't do anything especially clever because it was pure luck that I met the person I would marry, and that he had the force of mind to be more traditional than I was. But if I had not met him, I can totally see myself just bumbling along and feeling that these things were not important. And I think that's one of the things that I would try and convey is to men and women, that if you want a serious relationship in your life, you have to be serious minded about it. And you have to, when you date, date purposefully. Don't put up with shit. If think that, what is my end goal? My end goal is whatever it is. I want to meet someone seriously. I want to have children. So, after age 22, I stop effing around and I start thinking, this is my goal. And you'll have different relationships and you'll have ups and downs, but your goal will be your goal. And I think part of the problem is young people don't have this sense, as you say, of looking at yourself as 40 or 50, and just kind of rolling with things and putting up with temporary relationships and pseudo living together and dating for a long time with someone you don't really like, instead of just saying, you know what, this is shopping. I'm going into the store. I'm going to find the dress for the prom, and I'm going to look at a lot of dresses, but I'm going to get that dress. And just being serious minded about what you want and realistic about your long-term goals. And it may be, as you say, it may be like, I don't think I want children, or I don't care if I have a relationship. Fine. But if you think you want those things, then you have to treat them more seriously and give them at least as much attention as you do to your career. Like, if I want to be, a partner in a law firm by age 35, what else do I want? I want to be married, or I want to be a mother. Give them that serious attention. That's all I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's good advice. I mean, there's so much focus on like romance and love that we get sort of swept up in that and forget to think about what our goals are in the relationship, because it's like, oh, you're like having great sex or you're in love. And, this is my pattern. I'm not talking about
Well, at
everybody
least
else.
you're
And
having
like, I'm
romance.
so
I
much
think part of the
better.
problem we're saying is that people aren't having even romance. It's just these like
Yeah.
shitty
These
encounters.
endless like casual encounters.
Yeah.
I know. I think that's really depressing also. I guess I mean, part of the thing that modern feminism has gifted women with is this idea that if you criticize anything about women, or you say like, well, what's your role in this, or you kind of ask for accountability or something like that, it's called judging, or even better, shaming. So,
Mhm.
it's like, oh, you're shaming me, and it's like, well, I'm not really shaming you, but I'm sort of thinking critically about what you're doing here and asking you why you're doing it, and if this is really serving you. I guess maybe that makes you feel bad, but like, we
Right.
can't just
Well, we
not
have
have
a
these
right not to
conversations
feel
because you
bad, I
might
think,
feel
is the
bad.
message.
Yeah.
The right to good sex, the right to never feel bad after sex. That's what a lot of this comes down to.
And to not have anybody question like whether or not, yeah, your behaviors are really actually empowering behaviors. Like,
Right.
are these
Or I
really good?
said yes, but I didn't mean it, and you should have read my mind, and now I regret that I did that, and it's your fault.
Right. I guess I'm interested to know what you think. I mean, obviously in feminism we talk about gender and masculinity and femininity a lot. But I sort of started to realize that for a lot of people, when they think about or when they talk about masculinity and femininity, they're not talking about it or thinking about it in the same way that feminists are. And it's sort of, we end up kind of like talking past each other because of that. Like, I know what radical feminists mean when they talk about femininity and masculinity, but most people aren't radical feminists, so they don't think about things in that way. But I'm curious to know what you think about those roles and words. Are these sort of ideas that should be thrown out? Are they inherently bad ideas? Are they neutral
What,
concepts?
that
Like,
there's inherently masculine and feminine traits? No, I don't think they should be thrown out. I don't think they should oppress you. I don't think one should be seen as superior or, dominant, but I think that they totally exist. And this is the other thing. Like, I like maleness. I'm attracted to maleness. I like sinewy muscles. I like that. That it's the French and vive la différence. Like the reasons men and women, heterosexuals, are attracted to each other is because of their differences. And if a man is more like me, I'm not going to be attracted to him. I'm just not. I don't want to be with another woman. I want to be with a man, and whatever that comes to. And that's why we have to work through, and we have to work through our differences in the sense that we have to get along. We have to respect each other. But I don't want to deny that there are differences. The same way that I think that fathers bring, or men bring, unique strengths as fathers as women do as mothers, and they're different and they're complementary. It doesn't mean you have to be oppressed as a woman. It doesn't mean, and I think, again, to go back, that's why the categorizing these things in power dynamics is terrible, because ultimately they're very complementary and can be very complementary. And modernization, the modern world has given us a great basis for respect and understanding that these traits should not oppress either side. But I also like the differences, and I don't want to, and we've found that, there's been study after study that very feminist men are not attractive to strong women. Like, we just don't want that. So let's stop pretending we do.
Yeah, I mean, I said on my channel recently, this isn't the first time I've said this, but I was like, I like alpha men. Like, I want a man who's like a man. Like, I'm attracted to masculinity. I'm attracted to a man who's stronger than me and bigger than me and taller than me and who's like a leader and who is, confident and, to be honest, kind of like dominant, like somebody who can take charge. And that's not because like I want to be like submissive all the time or like I'm passive. Like that's not my personality. I'm not a passive person. Like, I'm a confident person and I'm pretty like assertive and, like I know what I'm doing. Like, but at the same time, that is, I think, something sort of natural, and I don't care. Like, I'm not gonna like apologize for that because it's not politically correct. It's what I'm attracted to as a heterosexual woman, and I do think that there should be a kind of like dynamic in a relationship. Like, I don't want to be in charge of the relationship. I don't want to be the dominant one in the relationship, which even, that means even more so that I need like a masculine man, because otherwise I'll like kind of like
Right.
steamroller him, right?
Right.
Like, but I think, like, some feminists are unhappy, and
Right. And
maybe alpha is not a
men
use.
get mixed messages. Like, they're terrified that, on the one hand, we want them to pay for dinner and decide where to go on the date and be, open doors and be, as you say, authoritative. And then on the other hand, then we're like, oh my God, if you do that, it's like, I don't know what to think. I could be oppressed. It's so stupid. I mean, it's just sad. And I think it's sown tons of confusion. And something that I feel for this generation, my daughters, that they have to work through, and I hope they're able to.
So do you think that there's gonna be or do you see some kind of backlash? Do you see, like, I've seen conversations and debates happening online that say like, oh, because feminism kind of got so messed up, or feminism took it too far, however you want to frame it, the backlash is this like return to, they say trad fem, like this return to like traditional femininity and
Yeah,
essentially like
I
traditional
don't
gender
know.
roles.
I don't know. I mean, the species has to procreate. We'll have to figure out how to do that. I mean, in the 90s, we saw a lot of women. This was the time I was writing about reevaluating motherhood and marriage. Then we saw, suddenly traditional marriages just come back in a huge way. The bridezilla phenomenon, after like people were getting married on a beach and egalitarian make up your own word ceremonies, suddenly we were back to full scale, weddings. So, there will always be a back and forth corrective. I don't know what's going to happen. I think people, whatever the culture is telling them, I think you still see, as you have articulated, women want what women want, men want what men want, and there's going to, whatever the prevailing orthodoxies are telling them, they're going to find a way to work it out. And in the end, people still want to be together. They still want families. They still want meaningful connections. It may be taking them longer to get to those, but I think in the end, it's what we all want. And I'll just have faith in humanity that it'll work itself out.
Yeah, well, again, nature seems to take care of itself, and we do remain a part of nature, whether people like it or not.
Just whether we like it or not.
I'll let you go. Thank you so much for your time. It was really awesome to chat with you. I hope that we can.
May, it was lovely to be on your show, and thank you for having me.
Okay.
Good to see you again.
You too. Have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.